Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's PMI Friday webinar, Big Data to Power Improvement, with the fantastic Rich Seddon in the chair as your host this week.
Fantastic, I'll take that.
Start with a high, Rich, start with a high, that's my motto. My name's Susanna Clark. I'm going to be facilitating today's session, and that includes running all the Q&A desk, and we're going to be using that throughout the presentation. So you can find the Q&A and the chat buttons on your Zoom control panel. Please do put any questions, observations in there, any comments, and I will put them to Rich as we go through today's webinar. The webinar is being recorded today, and we're going to send you a link via email early next week. That will have the full recording and also the audio and the presentation you're going to see today. As usual, we're also broadcasting live on Facebook and on LinkedIn. So to those of you who are joining us on those live streams, we welcome you. In future, to be able to participate in any polls and receive the recording via email, if you want to make suggestions for any future topics, then please do register for the webinars, which you can do at pmi.co.uk/webinars. We're going to send everyone who's registered for this webinar a short voice of the customer survey at the end, and we're always really grateful for your feedback and in particular your suggestions for future topics. So please do complete that and send us your thoughts. We really look forward to seeing them next week. Thank you to everyone for your continued support, and now I'd like to hand over to Rich.
Thank you, Suze. Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome, as Suze says, wherever you are in the world. I can see we've got a diverse mix in the group today, so you're all very welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rich Seddon. I'm one of the managing partners at PMI. On screen at the moment, you'll find my contact details, email address, and my LinkedIn. Do connect, drop me any questions that you may have afterwards, any reflections. We always love to hear from you. And the same applies throughout the webinar. We use the chat functionality, keep this conversation going, keep me on my toes. Suze will put those questions to me, not just in the formal Q&As, but also chats and observations. And what we're really interested in is your observations and how this resonates or not in your world and your environment. Perhaps you've seen some of the topics from a different angle than I'm describing them from. Throw that into the chat. We'd really like to hear from you. And the same applies on the live streams as well. Please do use the chat there as well, and we'll keep an eye and hopefully feed that in if we can. So what we're going to cover today, the topic, big data is the topic, but specifically big data to power improvement, continuous improvement, business improvement, OPEX, performance improvement, you pick your title for it. But specifically what we're interested in here is what can big data do to help enhance your improvement efforts, your improvement programs, projects, and so on and so forth. So in order to do that, the things we're going to cover, talk about definition, because frankly, in my experience, there's lots of different definitions. And the terminology around big data and the definitions around it are pretty varied. And once we've done that and put some kind of lines in the sand as to what's in scope for today's discussion, I'm going to talk about how, as improvement practitioners, you can use big data to make predictions, make more informed decisions, and critically gain better customer insight. So we're going to explore that in a variety of ways. Again, I'll repeat, do let us know your observations as we go through. So let's start on this definition. What do we mean by big data? So no discussion on big data would be complete. In fact, I think it's a statutory obligation when discussing this topic to have the nebulous imagery that you see on your screen before you. Of course, I'm being slightly tongue-in-cheek here. But this is what it's become. This iconography, this imagery comes around it. And frankly, I think the terminology is risking becoming as meaningless as this graphic you see before you. So at PMI, we try and define what we mean by big data in three terms, and we call them the 3 V's: volume, velocity, and variety. So thinking about volume, in order to qualify as big data, as it were, i.e. what's different, there needs to be lots of it, and in the current environments, that's fair enough. But look for that key indicator first of all. Is there volume of data? Second is around speed, the speed at which it can be acquired, the speed at which it enters into use. And a key thing for us as improvement practitioners is the speed and the velocity at which we can utilize it in order to make a difference and to implement improvements. And then finally, and possibly the most critical differentiator here, to move from just lots of fast data into big data, as it were, is the variety. Now, that's probably the clincher here to make the difference. A variety of data sources. So we're not just talking from one type of system data or one kind of device data. We're taking an entity, and I'll talk you through some examples shortly to illustrate this. We're talking lots of different angles and lots of different data and variety of sources around the same transaction, let's say, in this case. As I mentioned, I'm going to take you through a couple of examples straight away before we move into a poll after that, because I'm interested in how this is resonating and how this fits with your real world. So I will keep coming back to these 3 V's: the volume, the velocity, and the variety. Those 3 together satisfy the PMI definition of big data rather than just being data. So let's think about this in a retail environment, first of all. And then I've got, once I've done this, I've got a manufacturing environment as well, and another case towards the end of the webinar. So what makes big data in the retail environment? So in a traditional retail environment, pre-big data, typically the main source of data that was available were sales volumes. So you could see how much of a particular product line, product group you were selling. From the transaction data, usually coming out of the till, you could see the time of day, possibly the week, which enabled you to deduce some seasonality in your demand. In the bluntest form, a retail front end, that's pretty much it. So we had lots of that data, satisfied at least one of the V's. If you're doing lots of sales, it may have satisfied the second, the velocity, but not much in the way of variety. So move that on a few years and start thinking about the evolution and growth of loyalty schemes, retail loyalty schemes in the 1990s, where you start getting another layer in this pyramid of jigsaw pieces that I'm putting together here. Overlay on your sales data things like basket composition, so the products that an individual is buying, complementary products, so they buy a collection of different products together. You can deduce that from the loyalty data. And from that, you can infer some preferences. So you might regularly buy cat food and cat litter. It's a reasonable deduction that you may have a cat. And that's a typical piece of retail insight from a loyalty scheme. And then you've got some demographics as well, which enables you this whole new world of being able to see who is buying those products. Combine that with your volumes and time of day, you can see who's buying your products, what are they buying it with, and when are they buying it. But it pretty much stops there until you enter in this environment an e-commerce and social media overlay. And suddenly this whole other world, and here we're starting to edge into the third V here, this variety piece. You can suddenly see what customers didn't buy, which in a retail store, even with a loyalty scheme, you've no chance of understanding that. You can see what their journey was. How many pages did they view? What products did they view? What did they click on before they actually added items to their basket? What did they remove from their basket once they'd added it? How did they respond to promotions? Did they take something out of their basket that they already had in a similar category? A whole world of insight that previously, with just the sales data or even the loyalty data, you had no insight into seeing. And which reviews did they read? How long did they spend on those pages? And what brands and search terms did they put into the site? So you put those things together. You've got volume, you've got variety, and you've got velocity. So the 3 Ds coming together to create a big data environment. But what does that mean for us as improvement practitioners? Well, critically, it's this subject of insights. And we're going to keep coming back to this over and over again. Why are we doing all this? Why are we interested in this data? It's not just data for data's sake. In our world, it's got to be about gaining insights. And in this example, gaining insights to allow the tailoring of offers, ultimately, offers and messaging, ultimately to improve sales. In fact, allowing the creation of needs that customers didn't even know they had. And we're all familiar with platforms such as Amazon, who are masters of this. But this analogy of the velocity, the variety, and the volume applies in many different settings. So let's turn this around a little and look in a completely different setting. So manufacturing and big data. What do we mean by big data in the manufacturing world? Output data, traditionally, finished goods, work in progress, orders outstanding, one layer. Add another layer of that, which you may have some measures of takt time, capacity utilization, production rates, productivity perhaps. But then you add an overlay of sensors from the so-called Industry 4.0 point of view, with a generating data that enables you suddenly to be able to see the live status of production, RFID tags allowing you to see product and equipment location, smart sensors that report equipment status in real time, failure rates, critical indicators. But here's the common theme. Again, it's about gaining insights from the 3 V's to inform things in this environment like proactive maintenance, prediction of component failure, responsive production management, headcount requirements. And then when you go one step further and combine that to sales data, you've got demand prediction as well on manufacturing function. So bringing all those things together is what we mean by big data in the improvement world. And just on those examples I've talked through alone, you can start getting a sense of the possibilities. And I'm sure many of you are using these methods and terminology already. And you'll hear terms such as data lakes, data warehouses, data mountains in some cases, data swamps in other cases. Those are just expressions of how the data has been transformed in order to attempt to make it usable. And I'll talk you through some analogies shortly. But before we do that, I'm interested in your current practice. So let's have a look at a poll. Now, poll number 1, what I'm interested in is your current use of big data for continuous improvement. So hopefully that'll be popping up on screen for you very shortly. And you can see it's just appeared on my left. Select one of the answers that apply. So answer number 1, we don't use it at all. Answer number 2, we make occasional use. And answer number 3, it is widely used in my organization. So I can see you've started responding to that already, which is fantastic. Thank you.
I was reflecting on your example, Rich, and particularly in the retail industry. And I think my own experience, I think, like many people, when that first sort of predictive offers started to come up, I found that quite disconcerting. Now, when, I'm buying some black boots and it says, this black handbag looks quite nice with those, I'm like, oh, yeah, good idea. And, you become more used to it and therefore more inclined to accept it. So it's quite an interesting shift change, not only how they use the data, but also how we behave, I think, as a result of that data.
Yeah, I think the retail one is one of the more obvious ones, isn't it? And I think we can all relate to it. The key thing I was trying to get across in both those examples is around that variety, particularly, because corporate environments have been fantastic at producing tons of data for a very long time. But what's different with the big data environment is combining those 3 elements together. So it's not just lots of it; it's also appearing quickly and from a variety of sources. And it can make a recipe for a perfect storm. So very interested to see how we've got in terms of responses.
So I'm just about to end the polling, and then I will share it with everyone so that you can all see.
Okay, so let's have a look. So in the minority, as we don't use it, fantastic to hear. We make occasional use in the lead there at 44%, and we've got 39%. It's widely used in my organization. Fantastic. So in all 3 of those cases, I'd really love to hear from you in the chat. How are you doing that? And as we step through, again, do let us know how the examples and the things that I'm talking about resonate with you, particularly for your improvement practices. So if you're not using it, why not? Really love to hear that. And I've got some analogies I'm going to build in later on as well, and on the other two as well. So do let us know.
Thank you, everybody. I will stop sharing those now, but if you need them back, just let me know.
Thanks, Suze. Cheers. Okay, thank you everyone for that. That's great. So for anyone that has ever attended a webinar that I have presented before, the next slide will come of no surprise. I did previously call it same old, same old. I've changed that title to before starting. Now, gasp and grip onto your seats. Anyone that's seen this before, you will not be surprised. And why should you not be surprised? Because it is the ubiquitous model. Doesn't matter what you're trying to do. Previously, the last webinar I delivered was about digital automation, daily digital process automation. It applies here before. Being clear on these three questions is one of the most useful things you can do as an improvement practitioner. What are we trying to accomplish? This is particularly relevant, and I always bang on about this when technology is in the mix, because it's so easy to get distracted. So being clear up front before starting, before getting carried away about what data is out there and what the possibilities are of the technology, the sensors, the transformation, the insights that you can develop. Be clear on what you're trying to accomplish. In order to answer question 2, how will you know a change is an improvement? So what's going to tell you it's different? Before moving on to that question, the third question, what changes can we make that will result in an improvement? And you think back to those 3 V's I was talking about earlier on, the variety, the velocity, and the volume. And I just made reference to the potential for a perfect storm. It's absolutely true. And it makes this potentially even more important to understand, because you can make changes that don't result in improvement, in fact, cause deterioration in performance pretty easily given the scale, velocity, and variety of sources. So number 1 is a universal question at any level. Number 2, it necessarily demands theories and prediction before action. What is going to happen here, and how will we know? And then moving on to number 3 as rapidly as possible. And I'll always say this, don't ignore the orange circle there, plan, do, study, act. This does not mean this is a long, laborious process. You can do this quickly, you can do this rapidly, you can learn from it you can learn quickly, adapt your response, and move on to the next phase. I will no doubt refer to that later on, but apologies to anyone that's seen that before, but there's no way I'm going to progress without doing it. So having said that, bearing in mind, that's where you start. What becomes the number 1 priority? So this is straight diving in. We're going to talk about challenges shortly, but this is diving straight into one of my areas of advice here. When dealing with big data projects, it is absolutely fundamental to understand the process by which your data has been collected. That means going to Gemba, seeing where the data's come from, understanding in detail how that data is collected, being a customer if it's a customer-facing project, a process, following through the sensors, following the equipment, following a product through the line, sitting on calls in the call center, whatever your setting, whatever your environment. And why do I say that's so important and with such confidence? It's not just because I'm a management consultant and we say everything with confidence. No, folks. It's because understanding the data, understanding the process by which the data arrives at is critical to avoiding mistakes. I've lost count of the number of times that assumptions are made around where data has come from without truly understanding how it's arisen. So I always point people to go see, go look, see, go understand where this has come from, flowchart the process to really get a grip of where the data is coming from. That's also important because as you seek to enhance and add more variety to the mix, orienting it to your flowchart of how the process enables you to have something to anchor it to, and that's really important. So number 1 priority, and again I'll come back to this over and over again: understand the process, understand the context, and where does your data come from. So once you've got that, there are some challenges here. Lots of challenges. Here are just 3 of them at this point. Understanding what you've got. And I had an interesting conversation last week, and I haven't checked this afternoon's latest update, so I'm not sure if the person in question is on the webinar, but hello, Sarah, if you are. I had a conversation last week with a senior director of a company, a client of ours, talking on the subject of big data. And she was in a quandary as to where to start. She's been told by the IT department that they have a data lake. All the data you could possibly need has been added to the lake. That's great. But these data ecospheres can be huge. And just knowing what is being collected and where it's stored can be a challenge in itself. Now, some of your organizations have no doubt indexed, filtered, cleansed, sorted into a reusable universal data pool. Fantastic. I'd be really interested to hear what that journey was like if you want to share it in the chat. But many haven't. Many of our organizations have large legacy systems, some of which have been migrated into a common lake or pool, or as Microsoft now call it, the dataverse. Help us. But knowing how and what is there is really, really difficult, particularly if you're not an IT specialist. You're an improvement practitioner, and you may not understand exactly where it's come from. Hence my number one priority that I mentioned on the previous slide. So that's all very well. Once you've established what you've got, jumping straight over here to the right-hand side of this slide, understanding it once you have it. It is repeatedly my experience that field names, data formats, and structures all need to be understood before you can really make use of it. Without wanting to criticize typical practice, there's a lot of poor practice out there, especially around making data field names intuitive. And it's really, really easy in big data sets to make a mistake, to pick the wrong time signature, to pick the wrong field that has a very similar and familiar looking name, but actually it's the wrong one. And it could be referring to another item within the database. And because of the volume, because of the velocity, and because of the variety, it can be very easy to make a very big data mistake. Which leads me on to the middle point here in the center, making the data usable. To leverage the power of it for a business improvement, it does need to be in a fit state, both cleansed and with appropriate relationships and unique identifiers. Now, the relationships is an interesting one. Without wanting to go into the technicalities of data structures and data architecture, one of the things that's often missing from our large data sets are reusable relationships. So think about the third V, the variety, and you're taking data about a transaction going through a manufacturing system, a manufacturing process. You need to collect data from processes, from sensors potentially, from work order systems, from dispatch systems, possibly from operational systems and financial systems. How do you identify the transaction within there? Some of your data systems no doubt have a common data structure and a common identity and a tag that means you can say that transaction is that thing there, and we can trace it from A all the way through to Z. That, though, is pretty rare, and it does take quite a lot of work in order to make that possible. So an example I saw recently in an operations dispatch and logistics operation was product deliveries, combining the data from what's in the delivery, which vehicle it was on. That's all pretty straightforward, all coming from one system. But overlaying that, adding body cams onto the drivers, so that the journey and the dispatch and the operations either end where the loading and unloading is done can be recorded as well. In order to build, and ultimately is to improve health and safety and improve security of the product. Some of these products were high value. So they equipped every driver with a body cam. Great, that's adding variety. But how do you link that back to know that when you need that data and you want to analyze it and make decisions and informed decisions about how to improve the logistics process, how do you know that that piece of body cam footage links to that delivery run and that driver that's gone through the system, through the other independent system? A unique identifier is needed to merge those two things together. And many times that is quite hard work and it's overlooked, and the data is just dumped in one system for the cameras and left in one logistics system, for example, for everything else. And it's left to us to reconcile it together in Excel or in Power BI or some other data analysis platform. So the usability is really key. which hopefully you're now getting a clear sense of why I started back with the number one priority being understanding where this stuff is coming from. Because by doing that, you can stand a chance of addressing these 3 items that are on the screen here. So let's think about some of the opportunities that big data can present to us as improvement practitioners. First one, volume, scale. Now you'll notice I've put in brackets can. Scale can give reliability. Good science depends on a representative data set. That doesn't always necessarily need to be a large data set, but one of the things that big data environments have to offer is large data sets, and that can allow for better decision making. It helps to eliminate anomalies within that data and dilute the effect of those anomalies. It also enables you to make predictions because you've got that large data set on which to rely. And understanding the process performance and behavior at scale can help you make predictions, remember the 3-question model, for the impact of changes that you're proposing. And here's what it's all about. We're seeking to get insights, to create insights, not just collect the data to see the results. It's insights into improve our business improvement, to enhance our business improvement activities. So well-structured big data sets allow you to make connections between the events, the transactions, and the outcomes. So the customer or the process, performance, and behavior. And pulling that together is where the scale really comes in, because you've got a large data set on which to rely. And in order to maximize those opportunities, do use the trusted tools. Flowchart the processes that are involved. Sometimes it's appropriate to build visual maps and consider value stream mapping if appropriate. There's all kinds of virtual reality and 3D technology out there as well, which may be very helpful for visualizing and learning about the process. But number 3 here on this page, don't get distracted. On my next slide, I'm also talking about the ever-moving feast. But these 2 points are related. In this environment, because it's big, there's lots of variety, there's lots of volume, and there's lots of what's the third V? I've completely forgotten the third V. Variety, volume, and help me out, Susanna, please.
Velocity.
Velocity. Thank you very much. No matter how many times have I said these V's, and no one jumped in the chat to help me out there as well. I noticed. So getting a sense of my audience here. So don't get distracted by looking at chat as I just did. But seriously, the environment with the new technologies that are available, the sheer range of things that you can pick on, it's so easy to get distracted. And I'd really encourage you to bear that in mind and attempt not to. So stay focused, go back to the 3-question model and remind yourselves what it was you're trying to accomplish. That doesn't mean, and sometimes this is misinterpreted as meaning just narrow in and get blinkered. That's not what I'm talking about here. You can move on at pace because you're using PDSA, but the risk of getting distracted in this environment is high in my experience. So things to watch out for. The IT project list and competing priorities. Now, I don't know how many people we've got that are responsible for structuring on this webinar that are responsible for structuring big IT projects and controlling the IT project list. It is a thankless task. It's really difficult, and the competing priorities are really tough to deal with. And in big data environments, which is why I mentioned about the don't get distracted point, you really need to articulate your requirements in a very focused manner in order to get them actioned. And unless you have a really good self-service big data environment, it can be very difficult to create the requirements and generate the requirements you need without ending up making yet another IT project list. Whenever you read around the topic of big data, particularly from IT vendors, I find self-service is presented as something of a panacea. I'm sure you've all seen this. You can put this in a self-service warehouse, self-service dashboard series of whatever KPIs, displays, however you want to describe it. But to be honest, it's often not the case. And self-service, I have yet to be seen done consistently well. I've seen it done really well, but not consistently well. And part of that comes back to things like the field naming and understanding where the data is coming from and the structure of the data. And as if I'm reading and making conclusions about this piece of data, how does that fit with the rest of it? And this subject of context, which often makes the self-service very difficult. Not impossible by any stretch of the imagination, and that's not what I'm suggesting. And the distraction point, here it is, the ever-moving feast. This sector, by its very nature, and this topic of big data is changing all the time. So that's tough. You haven't got a stable platform in many environments from which to base yourselves. And I'll talk about change processes later on. As one of the things that as improvement practitioners, to build that stable platform for improvement, so you know the good science and can answer the question of whether a change is an improvement or not. Watch out for the ever-moving feast and the changes. So, do though make use of good old local process knowledge. So when I'm talking about context of the data and where it's coming from, the data is only as good as what goes in. So in many big data environments, say a service field team I was talking to a couple of weeks ago, large nationwide operation, hundreds of operators, hundreds of field service team doing asset maintenance in the field effectively. Without understanding the context and the process by which that data is collected, it all goes in quickly into a big data bank, and there's lots of variety of sources. There's stuff from the assets, there's stuff from sensors, there's stuff from scanners that the individuals use, there's stuff from there's data from the palm tops and rugged tablets that they use in the field. But the local process knowledge, that good old go to Gemba and see how it's being developed, allowed them very quickly to identify some varying practices with the interaction of and the collection of the data. It came down to something as simple as when local operators choose to have their breaks and whether they do a completion of jobs at the same time while they're still on site at the asset, or whether they do it all together and do 6 of them later on in the day. Now, see, that kind of, without that local process knowledge of knowing that that's how the data is being collected, you could make some very big, very rapid, and very varied conclusions about the process behavior, because those time signatures in that large data bank could potentially be distorted by the local process local process operators' behavior. So tapping into that, it's nothing new here, folks, but it's so easy to just go straight into the data and mine the data and deal with the data in isolation. But the good old process of where it comes from absolutely adjusts and changes the slant of this stuff. So thinking about one of the challenges is how to get big data into daily operations, so it becomes part of the way people do their day job and how they operate their daily processes. And the examples we talked about earlier on about the retail environments, the likes of the environments that retail environments like Amazon use, that's just built in. It's part of the customer transaction process. But we have the ability here to use the insights that are generated. And if we really want to achieve cultural change where decisions are made with data, we can tap into this big data sources to power things like daily huddles, to provide real-time performance insights. The data is being collected, but how do you express it? And building it into your daily process huddle structure is a really good way of enabling and tapping into the power and the insight that data has to offer. And then the third point on here is about demonstrating impact. Now, as improvement practitioners, we're all about demonstrating impact. The big data environment presents a whole world of possibilities of demonstrating impact, a whole variety of ways of demonstrating impact. But if you haven't answered those 3 questions I mentioned earlier on, then from the 3-question model, you can't demonstrate that impact reliably. It's question 2, really critical and essential to demonstrate our worth, to demonstrate our impact, and being mindful of the impact that potentially a non-data-based project may have, maybe having downstream in the dataverse. Be aware of that and go searching for it. The two things together, so the building into the daily huddle process, as well as demonstrating big project impact, can really help us, and it's a really useful tool to make use of as improvement practitioners. So I've started to flesh this out a little, so I'm interested in coming back to you again now to think about your challenges. And which of these do you recognize in your organization? Susie's going to put that poll up shortly. Answer 1 is there's more data than we can use. Answer 2, interpreting the data is difficult. Answer 3, it takes too long / is too difficult to get the data. Answer 4, it's difficult to be confident in data sets. Is it representative? And answer 5 is other. So this is a multiple choice one. You can select as many as do apply. And on the other one, we'd be really grateful if you can put that into the chat and we'll see what is coming up. You may have something that's not on there, some whole other reason that we haven't even thought about or come across. We'd be really interested to hear about that.
So as Rich said, that poll is launched. I can see that you're all putting your answers in. As it's a multiple choice, so you don't have to limit yourself to just one. If there are a couple of experiences that you recognise, then please do select both. And yes, please do add into the chat your other thoughts. We're always interested to hear those too.
And this specifically was challenges. So if it struck us when we did the run through on this webinar earlier on, these are all awfully negative. But then I remembered, yes, they're intended to be. We're thinking about challenges here. Okay, so I can see you're all piling in with the responses on that. That's great. Thank you very much.
So I'm just about to end polling now. So if you're still thinking of answering one of them, pop your answer in, select your option, and then I'm going to share so that everyone can see the results. In addition to these results, Rich, we've also had into the chat one of the others around integrating 2 sets of data, as well as dealing with multiple data sources.
Yeah. It's that point I was making about relationships earlier on. It's really tough and often is overlooked when systems are designed, and it can be a legacy system and a new system. That's the power of some of these terminologies like data lakes, where they've been put into third-party pools, if you like, or lakes, where those relationships have been sorted out. But where that hasn't been done, it can depend on some pretty complex Excel magic. So what's resonating here? All of the above, I'd say. It's out in the lead, though, is it's difficult to be confident in the data sets. Is it really representative? So I can absolutely share with you that that is our experience as well. That's probably the highest ranking item that we come across as well. And can take a very long time, can't it, to start querying that and really interrogating that. And I think that's why we start with that number 1 priority about understanding the process by which the data is generated, because it can help at that phase, rather than what is often we see clients doing is starting the other way around, looking at the data first, getting quite a long way through the analysis to try and draw some conclusions, and then realizing that there's something amiss here. It doesn't quite look right. You can't solve it completely by understanding the process, but you can help yourself a great deal, and not just assuming you know the process, which is the other thing we see a lot of, actually going and seeing it again with fresh eyes, getting someone else to come with you and have a look at it, whether it's a virtual process or a real life process that you can physically see. In a virtual environment, place some transactions through, mystery shop, place an order from A to Z. I've done that in many of our client environments, much to the disgruntlement occasionally of the clients when it produces completely different results to those that they thought were in their data set, or surprise in some circumstances. But it's a good skill to do. Go in with the open mind to use. It's going with the open mind, and ultimately, what we're talking about here is good science and good data science.
So thanks everyone for your contributions, and also thank you for your comments in the chat. That's really helpful.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting to hear about the third V, the multiple data sources. Okay, so using insights. I said at the outset, what we're all about here is generating insights. So turning big data into insights and those insights into competitive advantage is not easy. That's an official quote. You can take it. It was me just now. It's not. The process of transformation is not easy. So here's some key questions we need to ask ourselves. What is the context? Now, I've talked about this a lot. It's about understanding the fit of the process, but where does this data fit in the terms, in strategic terms, in process terms, in environmental terms? What are the things that are affecting that process that can influence the results that we're seeing in that process? And why I make such a significant point of that is because we need to be sensitized. We have these fingertips out there, need to be sensitized to changes and the environment in which that data is created. Because of the 3 V's, you're going to potentially make changes here and improvements that can have an impact very quickly and at a large scale. And how often is this the case? The customer gets lost in this. We get very carried away with improvements and particularly data projects and forget where the customer is in all of this and remain focused on what this process means to the customer and how it can benefit them. Because ultimately, we're trying to do this, aren't we? Turn those insights into competitive advantage. So understanding where the customer is critical. And then moving on to question 3, point 3 on this screen, which is how can we pilot? Where and how and using what data set and what kind of transactions can we test out some of these theories that this insight is allowing us to develop, and doing so at pace. Some of the key factors for success. I've mentioned number 1 already. Building those insights into everyday process and performance management is something we see done poorly very often. It's treated as a one-off exercise. You mine the data, draw the conclusions, but the next step isn't taken to I've gained all these insights. How do we make it routine? How do we make it part of the everyday so that it's in the hands of everyday users and isn't just something that's sitting either with IT or with the business improvement team to go mine this once in a while? The whole point of this move of technology and the opportunities that big data offers us is to enable live real-time reporting, and embedding that into your everyday performance and process management through things like huddles is really key. And one of the big advantages you've got here, and a new tool in your toolbox as an improvement practitioner to move that along. And I hear this over and over again. We just can't establish a single source of the truth in this business. There's multiple ways of looking at transactions. In fact, it was the same organization I mentioned earlier on. We're talking about some sales data, and there's multiple different ways of looking at the same sales data. There's a wholesale version, there's a retail version, there's with add-on margin, there's without add-on margin in there. One of the points I made earlier on was around the need for manipulation of these data sources to create data lakes, data mountains, data resources, so that you can establish the single source of the truth. And big data done well has done that, so that you can mine it with reliability and with confidence. But you still need to trust the sources, which is why I talk about the context so much. And finally on this screen, ensuring there's a robust change process in place. Business improvement teams are often not connected into the IT change process and structural change process further down the line with the operations. They're often an afterthought, to be honest, in my experience. But if we're to use this to build insights into our everyday process and performance management, boy, oh boy, do we need to be tuned in and connected and understand the change process. And if it's not robust, it's our responsibility to help make it robust. So what do I mean by a change process? I mean someone buying a new piece of kit so that the data set gets fed in and combines with the current insights you're getting and doesn't get treated separately. It's really quite easy with all of this stuff to create a whole new industry that's just merging the data together and combining it. That shouldn't be the case. This needs to be burden-free, which is where the power of these big data lakes comes in. But the change process and due diligence that is required is substantial. Doesn't need to be complex, but it does need to be robust and substantial. And it's everyone's responsibility to buy into that, and critically, the business improvement community's responsibility to ensure that we understand that and understand how it can affect the insights that we're drawing from the data. I've seen that quite a number of times, particularly I'd use the example just now of buying new kit, or moving a field, or changing a field and changing the way it's done. And that's where your number one priority comes in. Your flowcharts will expose that. If you've mapped the sources of the data in the first place and the processes, you can manage those processes appropriately to understand the impact of change. Without doing that, it's just change. And it may be beneficial, but you'll struggle to tell. And at some point of this, I am confident, it will no longer become beneficial and it will trip you up. Okay, so let's just think about the final example before we start moving into summary. I talked about a manufacturing example earlier on. I talked about a retail example earlier on. I'm going to talk about call center improvement in a slightly different manner here. So think about the 3 V's, which I can remember this time, I promise you. We've got demand data here typically in a call center type environment. Number of calls, time of day, duration, type of calls, number of abandoned calls, number of customers in the queue. Now, anyone familiar with call center operations will recognize those. They're the basics. They're very, very basics of operating a call center environment. But we overlay that, start moving towards a big data environment with some what we would call customer journey indicators. So how many of the problems are achieve first-time resolutions if it's a problem-setting environment? How many times does the customer need to come back? What are the wait times like? What are the net promoter scores, so customer satisfaction scores? And what channels are the customers using? In most customer service environments these days, there's anything from live chat, email, calls, call-based operations, and a whole raft of things in between, social media channels, etc., etc. Putting these together into a big data set, which is this jigsaw that I'm starting to put together here on the left-hand side, enables you to start getting a much better sense and draw better insights from that big data set. So overlay that again with customer data, so demographics, type of customers, repeat purchase information, e-commerce data, and sentiment data. Who'd have thought that would be possible? But you could start personalizing the customer experience through your service center. And really obvious versions of this, obvious examples of this that we come across quite often are using that big data set to personalize the customer experience when they come through. So think about it, overlaying problems with demographics. You could start getting a sense, if you've got a customer profile in your data set, start getting a sense of what problems are most often experienced by which type of customer, and have that preemptively appear on the operator's screen, that we know the customer is this type of demographic, they've made these kind of purchases in the past, and here's the knowledge base articles at your fingertips. Move that on a step further, because that's just empowering your first line support teams. Move that on a step further, and you can start proactively interacting with your customers. So if you can analyze this data appropriately and understand how many types of calls with this type of problem occur in this group of customers, you can proactively reach out to them. And some customer service operators are already well into this and proactively giving things like winter advice and boiler advice in the consumer market. And it's based on these big data sets that have been able to derive actionable insights and embed that into the day-to-day to do 2 things. One, it's enhance the customer experience. And secondly, it's to improve the efficiency of their operation. So less reactive maintenance is required. And it's a fascinating way to see these jigsaws start coming together to truly realize it. And I'm really interested when you say multiple data sources is the problem. Indeed, it is. It often gets in the way, and that's why the structure of the data that you've got is so important. but look at the possibilities. If you can eliminate the need for number of calls, you're not only improving your potentially improving financial performance here, you're also radically improving the customer experience. Because let's face it, customers don't care whose fault a problem is particularly. It's a problem and one they never wanted to experience. And if we've got this data at our fingertips to enable us to create that, to create a better environment for them, then it's really key that we work out how to unleash that power and potential. So moving into my summary. Key points that hopefully have come across here, and I'm repeating it again. Answer the 3-question model before starting. Please do that. It really will. And I'm really interested to hear from you after the event if that has resonated and whether you think that point has come across. Do look for the 3 V's. The irony of me putting that in there, and I forgot one halfway through the webinar. It's not been lost on me before anyone says anything. But do look for them and understand that process by which those 3 V's are arriving. Pilot quickly, remember the customer, and then finally, last but not least, embed the insights into the day-to-day.
Great, thanks very much, Rich. Any last questions, comments, please do add them into the chat or the Q&A. We had some feedback saying thank you very much. Lots of questions, but not quite sure on all the answers just yet. And I think that's it's a big issue, isn't it? And so the offer stands always. Please get in touch with us directly. Rich is always happy to hear from you. So do give us a call. Really happy to talk through both the questions posed and how to go about generating some of the answers. Before we finish today, I just wanted to let everyone know that we've been running a course called Leading Virtual Teams, which we've been running for a long time with our in-house customers. You know, as we all know, leading virtual teams isn't new. It's something we did before we had the pandemic. We had clients based across multiple locations, multiple countries, multiple time zones. I think what we found, of course, is that the challenge is bigger than it's ever been because we have so many more people now also working from home. And so we have now made this course available on our public schedule. So you can join, we're running it virtually, of course. So please do look out for it. It's on our website. You can find more information there. And it talks all about how, building and maintaining a virtual team and making that a really successful outcome. Finally, please look out for our Voice to Customer survey. You're going to receive that from us shortly. So please, as I said at the beginning, fill in your comments and also any suggestions that you have for topics in future events. And on the screen now, you can see our webinar for the rest of May. So please get in touch, register. If you have any questions about what we'll be covering, please just give me a call. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. And on behalf of PMI, on behalf of Rich and myself, I'd like to say a big thank you to you all for joining us this week and wish you a very safe and a very relaxing weekend. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining us.